Hello everyone, Matt here. So the following is an interview with Dr. Mahault Albarracin. She's an expert in cognitive computing and active inference, a polymathic reasoner, so she covers philosophy, sociology, sexology, AI, cognitive neuroscience, FEP, metaphysics, maths. She's co-authored with Chris Fields and Karl Friston, two previous guests of mine and very well-respected figures in their fields. 55 plus research publications and an Erdős number of 4. And she's also Director of Innovations at Versus AI, so she's a very, very accomplished person. And thoroughly enjoyed this interview. She's not only got a brain the size of a planet and just has an answer for everything. She's also got a sense of humour. She's warm. She's funny. She's extremely animated and charismatic. What a fantastic interview! I really enjoyed it, and hope you do too. Cheers, guys. Bye. Hello.
Hi,
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It's a beautiful day today.
Is that right? That's cool. Congratulations on your PhD defense. That's fantastic news. So I guess some sort of celebration was in order, was it?
Absolutely. You may now call me doctor.
That is fantastic. Dr. Mahal, is that right? That Mahal Albarracin?
Yeah, yeah,
How was
absolutely.
how was that? So could we just sort of kick off by just talking a little bit about your background, how you ended up in cognitive neuroscience, and and I've got this kind of question, this daft question, really, kind of, are you a philosopher or are you a scientist or are you some sort of combination of the two?
I love that question. I mean, my path is a bit eclectic. It reflects the fact that I'm interested in everything, so I guess the question also reflects that.
Hmm.
I've always been drawn to understanding how the mind works, individually or collectively, and basically how we can formalize that understanding. So my academic journey really reflects that interdisciplinarity. I just finished my PhD in cognitive computing at UCAM, where basically I focused on active inference as a conceptual framework to connect different disciplines, and ideally to connect social sciences with more hard sciences. And so you bridge cognitive science, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and ultimately social theory into one common modeling approach. So I don't know that I could call myself a philosopher, but I have done and touched on and collaborated with philosophers. I don't know if I can call myself a scientist, but I have done science and experiments, and I've published in peer reviews, and I've got a PhD. So I guess you would call me uh, enlightened, something like.
I'll take that. Look, something like around 50 papers, I think you've published, right? And that's sort of going back to 2013. So you've been doing this for, you're an expert, right? Cognitive science, social science, metaphysics, consciousness, active inference, FEP, ethics, sexology, gender, epistemology. It just goes on and on and on. And so so I've watched a few of your talks as well. And I thought, what do we talk about? Because there's so much that we could talk about. So I guess what we could do, potentially have conversations going forward. But I've got some sort of broad areas. I mean, I thought we could start by talking about your PhD topic. What was it you were defending? It was just a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it? It's so recent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what was the topic and what were you saying?
So basically, I was really trying to discuss how we have a problem of communication across different disciplines. Oftentimes, we think we say the same thing, or we think we mean the same thing when we're using the same words, or worse yet, we reinvent the same concepts with different words, meaning that we're not even talking to each other.
Mm,
And so this really slows down science in multiple ways. And ultimately, it makes it so that we think that we don't need to speak to each other in order to move forward. And in fact, this has been a critique that has been leveraged against active inference in the literature, basically saying that a lot of people had a lot of hubris reinventing a wheel that had already been explored in social sciences. And so what I tried to do is take some isomorphisms that I identified in my master's and try to map them on a mathematical framework that had an interesting topology. and show that these isomorphisms could naturally be leveraged to speak about existing phenomena such as social scripts. Social scripts are particularly interesting because they're identifiable, even though in the literature they're hard to formalize. We can all point to something that we can identify as a social script, right? Like the
mm,
restaurant script, like it's so
mm,
clear. But
mm,
somehow there's no clear way to make predictions with it.
mm.
So what I was hoping to give back to social sciences is the ability to leverage their extraordinary and well-documented theories and make usable predictions with it and sort of strengthen the frameworks as we go.
Right. Okay. Is this so? Does this relate to the paper that talks about the physics and metaphysics of power, so sort of social power? Because that is just what a emphatic title to start with. But is it related to that? Because that's your most recent paper, I think, from February, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So in essence, it sort of is. We just had it published in Entropy, like I think a week ago.
Mm,
Um, Effectively, all of my work taps into this notion that our cognition is shaped and shapes a form of reality, like phenomena, right? So that's where we get into neo-materialism, where phenomena is co-constructed by mutually reinforcing um, entities that measure each other, right? So
mm,
here, in terms of social power, if you take my thesis and you speak to the different things that we sort of externalize and that reinforce patterns of perception and existence and therefore measurement and action, ultimately what you get is these attractors. And these attractors sort of pull us in various directions. And so the notion of power here
mm,
is how are we able to move these attractors where we want them to be by shaping attentional
mm,
fields. And we can
mm,
see this very clearly, right?
mm,
Media does this. All propaganda is basically this. All legislation and regulation about what is allowed and not allowed. Like, can you go in that building? Can you access that data? All of that is a way to shape your attention and
mm.
shape your access to certain kinds of information, such that you follow certain kinds of behaviors.
Mm. So can there be wise decisions about which of those kind of models to reinforce, for example? I mean, there's some sort of conceptual link with the kind of work Mike Levin's doing. It's almost like what is the bioelectric field to be able to encourage
Yeah.
the right kinds of social norms and so on. Um,
Absolutely. So Mike
yeah.
Levin's work is really, really close to what we're doing. We've had multiple conversations where he speaks at the cellular level, I speak at the societal level, and we find that we're literally saying the same thing, especially in
Mm.
terms of resilience and identity.
Yeah, yeah. And just on that, there was because Mike's got an amazing academic site on YouTube, and there was a talk by a guy talking about biology in the realm of social modeling and so on, sort of so sociology being an extension of biology and this kind of stuff. So it's again, it's an example of those field convergences, isn't it? And
No,
so that's
exactly.
so what you're talking about is some kind of meta language that allows a kind of scale independent description across these different disciplines, and also raises the question: do these different disciplines even exist?
Precisely, that's exactly the right question. So I think what we're identifying is like emergent structures, right? So what active inference doesn't give you is ultimately this notion of historical structure. You can speak of potentially how a structure might develop given the starting state and some processes, but it doesn't give it to you from the get-go. And so what
Mm,
these disciplines sort of identify is like the right level of perceivable coarse graining that we, as a sort of common entity, have been able to capture through tools that we find, usable. So, for example, anthropology, sociology, like how do you define a society? At which point does it become a superstructure and we're no longer
mm,
talking of sociology, but geopolitics? Like, at what point do we speak of history rather than just the anthropological remains? Like I feel
mm,
like most of the disciplines are basically just our best attempt at
mm,
capturing those phase shifts that make it difficult to
mm,
predict past this scale. But the more we develop tools, the more we're able to find these sort of interstitial
mm,
scales and eventually I mean, there's really no difference between the different scales because of course you've fine-grained it so much that the boundary itself really doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
So is the FEP the beginnings of that meta language that can just apply to all sort of phenomena, if you like? Is that would you say that?
I think it's I think it's a good bridge. I think ultimately you still need the other languages. Like I
Hmm.
wouldn't just speak in terms of FEP, right? There are phenomena that have been identified that are important to discuss and to identify, right? Like you need to be able to point to something real and give it this sort of um, conceptual boundary. And that conceptual boundary allows you to speak to certain kinds of processes that you now have the ability to mechanize.
Mm.
But the mechanisms, yes, it is interesting to speak about them in terms of the FEP because I wouldn't say it's simple. It's not quite simple, but it has this elegance to it, such that it's possible to break down. In fact, because it is scale free and because it speaks to these um, hierarchical structures, you're able to sort of break down what you need and then speak to different layers of different abstractions. And you can easily compose the system that you want within a set of boundaries. So,
Mm.
yes, I think it does qualify as part of the lingua franca, but you still need to do this work of bringing into our common language the different concepts that you hope to map, which was partly what my thesis was an example of. So my thesis was providing an example such that we could show, look, it is possible to make this bridge in at least two or three disciplines. You could do it for more, but you'll still have to do this work. It doesn't just happen simply because we have a common language.
Mm. You've published with Karl Friston and Chris Fields, and which means you must have what's that maths number? Is it the Ergos number? Is that the one? Is the one that it means you're a certain number of separation stages away from this mathematician called Erdős. Because
Yes.
yeah, so your Erdős number is 4, right? Because you've published with Chris Fields, and that is below the mean, which is about 4.3 at the moment. So you're on the cool side, you know.
Yay,
That's
good
freaking
for
awesome,
me.
man.
I
Yeah.
am very honored to be publishing with them. They are incredible
Mm.
thinkers and writers, and every time that I get to speak to them, I'm a little bit starstruck. So yeah, that is pretty
Yeah.
cool.
And communicators as well. I mean, I could just listen to Chris Fields just forever. You know,
Yes.
the patience and the pauses and the poise that he has. It's just liquid beauty, isn't it? I could just honestly. Have you seen his physics as information processing course? There's like 6 modules. Have you
Yeah,
been?
well, so
I don't get out much, so I've watched it twice.
no, it's a wonderful series, and I
Yeah.
encourage anyone to go and watch it. I'm
Mm,
part of the SAB of the Active Inference Institute, so I was part of some of those organizations. And I remember the first time I heard Chris Field, which was in a different meeting. I think it was in the theoretical neurobiology group that Karl hosts, and he came and gave a chat.
mm.
And he presented the same idea but condensed in 1 hour. And I remember we were, as you do, you're in a meeting and you're chatting with other people. And I was chatting with a bunch of people being like, "Oh my God, are you guys as impressed as I am? Are you getting as cool as I am?
Not
This is
really,
so cool."
yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. No, I mean, yeah. No, what an honor to be with these guys because they are really changing things. You guys are really changing stuff here, right? I mean,
Well, I
I
find
suppose
that
so. Yeah, go on.
I mean, Karl for sure. I mean, he's already had
Mm,
an incredible impact on the literature, and I feel like the momentum he's created and the
mm,
integration of the different kinds of, say, consciousness approaches,
mm,
as well as the different fields he's been able to bring together, that's laudable in itself.
mm,
But I find that Chris Fields has a more nuanced and perhaps to me more interesting. Um, benefit to the world. I think what he's doing is precisely the core of what you were discussing earlier, which is he is breaking down certain dualities that we had previously taken for granted. So all these distinctions between the different scales, and
mm,
ultimately those distinctions between self and other. With what
mm,
he is doing, I feel that we are starting to put a finger very precisely on the mechanisms that may in fact be the core mechanisms that create this sort of illusory boundary, right? Ultimately,
Mm.
it's just an illusion. And
Yeah, because he
I've
strips
never
everything
read
away.
some.
He strips away time. He strips away space. All of the assumptions are gone, right? So,
I mean,
but
a
then
lot
he
of
still
people are.
manages to produce a system that works. You know, the communicating boundaries, as you say, there's only a finite amount of information to get across, and it even feels intuitive. It sounds something like my experience of the world, right?
I mean, precisely. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's why it's very enticing. But I mean, he's not the
Mm.
only one who's doing very similar work. I find that Donald Hoffman
Mm.
is touching on very, very similar intuitions as we are. I
Mm.
mean, I couldn't delve as much into explanations of Hoffman's work, but I have read some of it. And while reading it, I was like, wow, I mean, we agree completely. He's
Yeah.
going about it in a slightly different way, but ultimately, I mean, we're getting to the same point. I think
Mm.
the only difference is that Karl and Chris are making no commitment to something like
Mm.
panpsychism, whereas I feel like Hoffman's whole point is ultimately kind of panpsychism, right? It's like the
Well, I don't know.
field is.
Isn't he almost? I think he's almost over the fence into idealism. You know, because he's saying that consciousness itself is fundamental, and I mean, he
Yeah,
says
yeah.
the particles are literally just representations on the dashboard, right? He said they don't have standalone existence. So, well, I don't know. I mean, what do you think? You're the
No, no,
expert.
I mean exactly. So I think Karl and Chris are not going as far as that.
Mm.
But technically, there's nothing in the FEP that precludes it. So
Mm.
there is no fundamental disagreement in those premises. It's just that
Mm.
they're not making such claims as of
Mm.
now. And
Yeah.
I find that Hoffman's approach is also very enticing because you can retrieve time and space in a way that feels very congruent with Bayesian mechanisms, basically.
Mm. Yeah. Sort of probabilistic
Mhm.
networks and all sorts of stuff. But I mean, again, Levin seems to be using a similar language, but without actually stating it, you know, crisply. But again, he seems to be talking about very, very similar concepts, you know, and he's seeing agency going all the way down, even to sort of logic algorithms that we can actually look at the innards of them, but they're still demonstrating strange collective kind of learned behaviors and stuff. I mean, do you have any views on that, or are we stretching out to?
No, no, no. I mean, I've had conversations recently with people who are also adjacent to Levin, and they also interpret his work in a very similar way that um, I don't know if it's idealism or if it's uh, a form of Platonic ideal, but ultimately, what Levin seems to be suggesting is that there are a set number of prototypical forms that they
Mm,
have natural ways to minimize the degrees of freedom from
mm,
each other, which does give some, uh, natural entailed physical processes and ultimately shapes and forms. And thus, and if we can understand those, we can understand the ways that we have optimal composition. And I feel like if we went all the way with these ideas, we could also make ethical statements, right? Like
mm,
there's some proto-ethical statements in there,
mm,
but ultimately, if we consider that this sort of Platonic ideal field is a conscious, similar kind of conscious field, then what we're getting back to is like what constitutes perception, right? What are the fundamentals, uh, the fundamental blocks of phenomenology, which ultimately give you back these degrees of freedom that are
mm,
lost. So yeah.
mm. Oh my God, that's just so that's so deep. I'm gonna have to go back over that sort of after the chat. What exactly was this? But no, there's some really, really fascinating stuff here. So yeah, the because Levin talks about that, doesn't he? The way that Platonic concepts sort of manifest in the world, like the normal distribution with the balls dropping, and you know, where is that stuff stored? And we get these things for free, you know, and we get logic for free. And I mean, do you have any views on that? You know, do you have a position on sort of mathematics, uh, Mal?
No, I don't think I have a position on his formalism per se, but I do think that it is an appealing perspective if you again look at it from a neo-materialist perspective, because there has to be some constraining factor, even if things are all co-constructed, even if things ultimately are just emergent phenomena.
Could we actually unpack neo-materialism because we just touched on metaphysics. So could we actually take a step back and say what is neo-materialism? Because I don't really know, to be honest, and I'm pretty sure some of the
Right.
viewers.
I mean, to be simple, it's just a response to materialism and postmodernism and trying to account for what constitutes a manifold of perspectives. I mean, Karen Barad and De Lanza were two of the authors that really delve deep. And Karen Barad is a quantum physicist, and so she tries to understand how certain principles like diffraction can sort of be understood, at least metaphorically, in larger scale phenomena. But ultimately, she brings it back down
Mm,
to the most base phenomena and says that it's all about measurement, right? So because it's all about measurement, it's about co-measurement and how things constrain each other and co-construct at the moment of measurement. And so if it is about measurement, it is about perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that there is, I'm gonna make an endless amount of perspectives. And this is where I think I'm getting back to Levin here. It
mm,
is possible that there is a constrained degree of possible perspectives and ways in which these perspectives unfold. And this is where Adam Safron's work becomes interesting. I always forget the acronym for his theory of consciousness, but he was on our paper on with Chris Fields. I think it's IW, Integrated World Model
mm.
Theory, IWMT, I
I'll look it
think.
up. It sounds
Um,
brilliant. Sounds fascinating.
yeah. And so basically what he was trying to do is he was trying to take every theory of consciousness and mash them together. And he honestly, for the difficulty of the task, I applaud his attempt, and we did use his work anyway, so I do
Mm,
think it has value. But in this work, he specifies that ultimately the point of consciousness seems to be structuring, right? It seems to be these spatio-temporal unfoldings that allow us to determine causality, right?
mm,
And so um, this is where you retrieve the logic. How can you make sense of causal chains given some constrained principles of reality and
mm,
and and ultimately maybe some of them some realities are different from ours, so logic doesn't just stop at where we are, but the way that it unfolds in reality and the way that it becomes relevant in reality is by constraining it to some principles that seem to somehow relate back to a degree of materiality. And then we get back to neo-materialism. What is
mm,
materiality? It's co-measurement, co-perception. And so this is where, like, again, we're back to this loop, like the constants of perception, the building blocks of phenomenology. What are these things which seem to somehow compose properly? And I think the missing pieces seem to be again in Chris Fields and in those theories. I always forget, but there's a few researchers. I'll send you the research afterwards. But basically, it's I think it's projective geometry, where basically they suggest that there's a focal point and everything about perception is just a sort of projection from that focal point to
mm,
the geometry around you, and
mm,
consciousness is shaped by the relationship between that focal point and the geometry around you, which naturally links itself to, attention and what constitutes protension and retention and horizons of perception. And so
mm,
if you mix all these ideas, these sort of geometrical, topological ideas, and how information encodes on boundaries, I feel like you're very, very close to a fully integrative theory about how causality and consciousness might itself unfold. So I feel like we're close. I think there's a little bit more work that needs to be done in integrating things a little bit more elegantly, but these
mm.
people are talking to each other.
Mm. There was something in what you just said there that reminds me of those amplitahedra. Was it Nima Akami Ahmed, the high energy physicist? He talks about these non-spatial, again, they're sort of like geometric structures that project into space-time. So again, these guys are removing the need for space-time within their mathematics, and they're getting better results. They're able to do better predictions with scattering amplitudes and things like that. So But again, it seems that this new way of thinking is emerging across all the fields. So is there some sort of, echoes of Thomas Kuhn? Is there some sort of scientific revolution going on? Is there a paradigm shift? And is it good? Is it a good thing? Are we getting closer to the truth?
I
And is that a
personally,
fair question?
no, no, I think so. I
Oh,
think we're
hello.
definitely, hello. I think we're definitely, I wouldn't know that we're close to a paradigm shift because I don't think it's permeated most of the literature. I don't think these are the most common ways to think. But I do
Mm,
think that we are all coming to a head with the limitations of the current paradigm. And so
mm,
multiple people are looking for what's next? Is it that we have some fundamental premises we need to change, or are there a few parameters we need to tweak? And so you can see this just in AI right now, right? Like there's this sort of shift is also, you can feel the tension where there's some people who say, oh, we just need to send more compute. So they're just tweaking parameters. And there's people who are like, no, transformers are fundamentally flawed. We need to move to something like, Bayesian inference or other kinds of model-based approaches. And therefore, it's not that you're going to throw away the baby. It's that whatever we have learned from this will have to be reintegrated afterwards to this new paradigm. But
mm,
we haven't let go of transformers yet, right? So I think it's kind of the same thing where more and more people are finding that those new explanations seem to be more confluent with existing theories, and more people are also becoming interdisciplinary, like because of the technologies that have evolved and because of the democratization of a lot of these technologies, more people can have expertise that spans over different domains. And so now they are seeing those patterns as well. So they're able to make those connections,
mm.
whereas before it was so siloized that, confluence was a little bit hard to reach and perhaps not even desired. So it might be that once we reach more and more confluence, and once people see that their fields are limited by certain patterns that may be stemming from underlying assumptions related to the fields, they may themselves seek out paradigms like those. I do find that predictive processing, active inference is gaining traction. I wouldn't say that quantum information theory is necessarily gaining traction, but the notion that potentially our assumptions about space and time might be not misguided, but perhaps not quite correct.
Mm.
That's also gaining traction. And then there's geniuses like Dalton Chaktivadival, for example, whose work um, spans these sort of arcane disciplines like topology and cohomology, and like that's just magic. That's just a magical world over there. Same as category theory, right? Like they're doing their
Yeah.
their wizard stuff, but because it has this sort of information embodied quality, you can sort of feel like they're touching it, right? So
Mm.
we might be reaching that point. I'd say we're not 20 years from a full paradigm shift, but more and more people, at least in my surroundings, are definitely aiming in that direction.
What sort of things will we be able to do once we've kind of cracked some of that stuff? How could the world change given those insights?
Well, so there's those who say, and I'm in contact with a lot of them, and I know Adam Safran is leading a lot of that work himself, but once we understand non-duality, or once we integrate non-duality, there are distinctions between self and other that become very toxic, that you identify as toxic, and you sort of start seeing that perhaps the empathy you reserve for yourself or those that are kin to you could be extended outwards. And so this has implications for how we treat, uh, you know, other nations, or the very concept of a nation, or the concept of work, or capital. So I feel like some of these notions, if we reach that point, may be affected. I don't know exactly how. Sometimes there's pendulum swings, right? When you go really far in one direction, it swings back really far. So if I'm telling you we're reaching for utopia, I might actually be telling you that once we touch the doors of utopia, we may swing back really far into hell. So, there's a world of possibles, but I think this is kind of the type of things that may change. Um, I think in terms of AI and perhaps our relationship to technology, if we were able to fully grasp these concepts, we would potentially be able to properly understand, whether we want to, um, how to imbue qualia into entities. And once we have that, well, what constitutes the stretch between my qualia and another qualia, and how perhaps can we connect these two minds? There was early on in my studies, there was this one research paper that I found so fascinating, and it stuck with me. It was about people in wheelchairs, so they handicapped, and they have people that work with them, right? And
Mm.
so they were measuring the affordances of people who were not in wheelchairs, and then the affordances of people in wheelchairs with people around them and without. And they found that the people in the wheelchairs, when there were people around them, felt this sense of extension outside of themselves to the affordances of those people. And to me, this is sort of a proto qualia extension, right? You're not
Mm.
quite feeling what the other person is feeling, not quite, but we're kind of in that realm, right?
Mm.
And I
Mm.
feel like if we can unlock what it is to fully deconstruct and reconstruct qualia, we may be able one day to see in each other's minds,
Mm.
to experience another reality fully, to properly transcend physical boundaries, and eventually, whether it's virtual reality, whether it's spiritual reality, whatever it is, we
Mm.
may be able to work with these stretches. And that's obviously without talking about if we're able to have a fully integrated scientific model of all reality. Like, I mean, we're far, far, far into the future, right? But let's assume that we blur all these boundaries, everything
Mm.
is interconnected. I mean, if you have that, then there's no question you can't answer. You
Mm.
can literally make any prediction because you have the entire scale that is fully solved ultimately, right? You have a practically deterministic model. So
Mm.
it would be interesting to see what kind of diseases we can solve, what kind
Mm.
of epidemiological frameworks we can apply such that people never get sick. Can we
Mm.
solve aging at all? Like, I mean, I feel like once you sort of unlock all of these, you've basically unlocked the doors to everything. And I think that's why people are very attracted to AGI, because it's like they have this new God in their head, They're like,
Mm.
we don't have to solve our own problems. We just have to find a God. We just have to find something that is smart enough to answer every question for us, and then we'll all be saved, right? And so it's just like,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
yeah, this
Because
proto.
I think a lot of us have reached the point where we might trust some AGI system more than we trust certainly most of the human leaders that we have at the moment, right?
I mean, okay, so I think it depends on the people. I think there's people who are very technologically skeptical, and I wouldn't blame them.
Mhm.
Also, based on the way technology is built right now, I wouldn't trust necessarily uh, all LLM builders to make an AGI that benefits me. I mean, their stated
Mhm.
goal is to replace us, not to make us happy, but to make companies more profit. So ultimately, an AGI based on those principles, steeped in those ethics, I wouldn't necessarily trust.
Mhm.
Um, but there is something to be said to, we're all very limited in our perspective, right? I know for a fact that right now, because of hyperconnection between everyone and everything, and the erosion of the trust in intellectualism and the trust in institutions, and the very concept of expertise, and the idea that we have access to all this information without understanding that information isn't sufficient. Information is ultimately just noise. What you have to do is structure it properly, and the structuring process comes with training your mind to sort of shape certain things and apply them through a different structure. And that's what education
Mm,
is, right?
yeah.
So forgetting that for a moment, we've come to a point where um, I think it's easy to think that an AI system that has a better computation capability, because it's just literally based on GPUs and it could run on server farms and whatever, and I only have my one brain and my brain is tired most of the time. I have to drink coffee. So I could understand how we would think, well, obviously it'll think better than me, right?
Mm,
And if you look at what ChatGPT outputs sometimes, and you're like, oh my God, it takes me 3 days to write one page, and it takes it 10 minutes to write 50. Like clearly there's this sense, right? Well, it's better than me. And to some extent, we've already found that these LLMs, and I will not call them AGIs by any stretch of the
mm,
mind, are already superhuman in some ways. So
yeah.
it's not an improbable belief. However, AGIs, if that's a thing that is ever going to exist, let's say superhuman artificial consciousness, let's say like that, because I don't
Okay.
believe that AGI will be one entity. I
Just
think
just
if we
briefly
have,
though,
yeah.
just briefly, do you think consciousness can emerge within silica?
Yeah, I don't see
Good.
any issue with that. If you take a fully functionalist perspective on consciousness, I see no issue with that.
Mm,
If you take the perspective that Chris Fields and I are taking, if you take Hoffman's perspective,
mm.
it's not, there's nothing that precludes it.
Okay.
And ultimately, if we consider that intelligence is a function of the interactions between nodes that carry information,
Mm,
then there's nothing that precludes silicon from being
mm,
able to be a form of sentient. That's
mm,
one of the papers that we put out with Inesh, but it was based on a paper again by Lance da Costa, or at least it was inspired by a paper by Lance da Costa and Karl
yeah.
Friston. And basically, what we're saying is, for now, we can't really measure the subjective component of consciousness. We can measure some neural correlates, or we think these are neural correlates. We're not even
Mm,
sure.
mm,
So it's always outputs, not
mm,
inputs, or not like direct first person perspective. So what we can do is measure what seems to be the driving factor behind consciousness. So why is a thing conscious? Well,
mm,
generally, or at least under the FEP, a thing is conscious if it has this ability to sort of um, return information to itself and then act on this information, right? It has the ability to some extent to navigate entropy such that it is able to maintain itself, right?
mm.
That's
Yeah.
a pretty basic definition. And if you subscribe to that, then anything that has the ability to self-model and
Mm,
self-sustain is
yeah.
conscious. And I think a silica would have this ability quite easily.
Hmm. Yeah, because some philosophers suggest that it's kind of metabolism, isn't it, that would give you consciousness. It has to be some sort of naturally, again, kind of big word there, but naturally emergent phenomena, a self-organized system, that's that kind of thing. Whereas obviously server systems don't look very fleshy, do they? And they're not very kind of emergent. They're constructed. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a position on this these days. I'm too confused.
Well, I mean, I
But
feel
then
like
again,
the
yeah, sorry. Because the things that you build these systems out of themselves are materials within this kind of negotiated world thing that
yeah.
we within. And I can't really give an account of their substantiality, what they really are truly, right? So for me to deny them, or and maybe there's some sort of panpsychist inside me here, but to deny them sapience or sentience seems crazy as well, because
No,
that's
I agree.
all I've ever been acquainted with is sentience and sapience, right? So why should I deny anyway? But yeah, that's
No,
another.
but like I think something to retort to that is like, would you say a protein is self-organizing? Go lower, would you say, molecules are self-organizing?
I
I
tend
mean,
to
to
think
some
everything's
extent.
alive. My current hippie trippy sort of metaphysic is everything is alive, right? I don't see how it could be seen as not involved because of this kind of apparent contiguity with all things, right?
I subscribe to that as well, but I unfortunately that to me becomes a little bit spiritual, so I try
I
to
was going to ask
keep
about that. Do you have a spiritual view, or even some sort of telos, or do you think there's some sort of purpose to this drama?
I do actually. I
Sure.
really do. I think, I mean, I like to hang out with those, again, those groups of interested in enlightenment, interested in Buddhism,
Mm,
interested in cyclical relationships and how ultimately we could potentially solve suffering by
mm,
understanding how phenomenology unfolds. And so,
mm,
that's the kind of things I find myself drawn to, but not because I'm a Buddhist myself, but more because I find that there are some, again, isomorphisms with what I believe, which is um, if I had to qualify something that resembles very vaguely the concept of God. And I don't I like I'm not Christian. I don't have a religion per se, but I have, studied some religions. I'm
mm,
familiar to some extent with the Quran and the Torah. I've studied some Hinduism and Buddhism. Um, Mostly by curiosity because I wanted to see what they were really about instead of just taking my news from some random people. Um, and so I find that there's some patterns that recur, and I'm not talking about the hero myth. Is it the hero's journey or the hero myth? It's
mm,
not that. I find that there's a sense that
mm,
we all seem to feel something common and ultimately nullifying, but also horrifying. And
mm,
this horrifying pull seems to drive us to continuously strive forward, and it is mysterious and uncertain. And I think all we're talking about, all everyone is talking about, is these pools of entropy and negentropy, right? As negentropy develops, it does so at the extent of the things around them. And so, in order to be, they destroy. And this
mm,
is cyclical. And it is also, um, it's a feedback loop. So you'll always, it seems like it's growing, but at the same time, because it destroys, it never seems like it's really going anywhere. And
mm,
so I can sort of sense this pull, and you can feel it in philosophy as well. I think you sort of feel it in science. I think that our current nihilistic sense is also seeking meaning now in this potential that, well, maybe if there is no distinct morality or easy morality that we can derive from some kind of principles, then perhaps existentialism is realizing, or at least moving away from nihilism is realizing that there is beauty in this horror, and this beauty we get to explore. Um, and if you want to structure it and be Christian, or if you want to structure it and be, just a hippie that smokes weed and has a good time, you do that.
mm,
But oftentimes if that same pull drives everyone, and we sort of come to the same conclusions. And I think that's why a lot of people study meditation and consciousness, because they've
mm,
also identified that when people meditate, they seem weirdly to come to similar phenomenological conclusions,
mm.
which therefore mean that there might be some underlying something, and if we could just touch it a little more. So yeah, that's my spirituality. I
Oh my
guess it's
God.
very blurry.
That's no, honestly, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for that. That's really, really deep and meaningful. You touched on so many different areas there as well. But let's just look at this meditation thing for a little bit, because if it is the case that, this idea of sort of dismantling your ego and kind of allowing, your pure consciousness, if such a thing exists, to sort of emerge. And I've been through this experience myself, and it's just freaking amazing, isn't it? Right. And I have these kind of sort of strange, kind of semi-psychedelic inner journeys with this stuff. And then I wake up, well, sometimes I go to sleep afterwards, right? And I wake up feeling so refreshed, and I feel like I've pulled something back from that experience, right? But And also, you've got cases with psychedelics that kind of seem to reduce brain activity, and yet people are having these most profound, complex experiences, right? So, what are your thoughts about the brain and consciousness? Is consciousness really in the brain? Is it what the brain does? Or is the brain kind of like a representation? Is it just kind of the appearance of our minds or something? Have you got any views on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it touches back to what I said earlier, where I think it's about the exchange of information between nodes that carry information. And so I won't go into the depth
Mm.
of what constitute the sort of subjective, that point of origin. I'm not going to go to that because I think that's not something we've properly solved. And I mean, if we had, we would understand exactly what consciousness is. So let's put that aside for a moment. I
Hmm.
think what the brain is just an extremely compact way to exchange and encode parts of information. And I say encode not in a purely computationalist sense, right? I'm not saying that there is only one way that information gets encoded through these sort of semiotic means. I really just mean um, there is information that sort of stabilizes through some structures, and then this information uh, gets exchanged between different poles that aggregate patterns or structures. And so what you really have with the brain and with its extensions is ways by which reality gets broken down at its joints. So I didn't coin that. That's a phrase that I love from Karl, and he keeps saying it and he uses it in the context of structured learning. How is reality carved at its joints? And I think the core of perspective, the core of consciousness is this way to carve things. And so your brain, however extended it is, and now in jointness with mine, we are now creating this system, right? You and I
Mm.
have got
Mm.
a co-constructed image
Mm.
together. Is it
Yeah,
in
yeah.
your head? Is it in my head? I don't think so.
Mm.
So I think for a moment there, we shared a part of consciousness, and there's a lot of hyper scanning studies. Guillaume Dumas does a lot of that, and I'm working right now with some people. I think his name right now is, Nicholas Hinrichs and Dimitris Bolish. They are working on studying the ways in which our brains synchronize and desynchronize, and what it means for us to synchronize socially and emotionally.
Mm.
How
Yeah.
do we feel when we are synchronized?
Mm.
And so perhaps what it means to have, say, a unified consciousness, it's just a degree to which we stay somewhat synchronized and we align towards given goals, and the ease
Mm.
with which information gets passed for coordination, right? So perhaps if you and I think exactly the same way and finish each other's sentences and are perfectly on the same wavelength, we have somewhat achieved a form of shared consciousness, right?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's beautiful. I was reading this book by Olaf Stapledon. He's an English philosopher, and he's kind of heralded as he sort of helped found science fiction, right? And he talked about his relationship with his wife in exactly the same way. He said we've achieved on a very very small scale that kind of overarching objective, which is to unite with other minds and so on and so forth. And I've always felt in relationships and friendships and stuff that there's a third person. If there's two of us, there's three of us, right? Because the relationship itself has its own character and has its own baggage and sort of, and there's a language that's associated with it, and it takes on an identity of its own, and we become subject to that.
Absolutely. I mean, oh my God, that is such a great, I love this topic. So, I, I'm gonna lay out a little bit of my personal life. I've had a lot of heartbreaks. And going through heartbreaks, I was talking to my friends. And at the time, Maxwell Ramstead and Casper Hasp had this theory. So again, this isn't me. These are their ideas and they're brilliant. Speak to them whenever you
Mm.
can. And they were saying, when you break up with someone, you literally lose a part of your brain
Mm.
because your brain
Yeah.
has mapped to some patterns, not only of them, but of yourselves together, the way that you will
Mm.
sample reality.
Yeah.
Because, like, a
And you
simple
might repeat
example,
those
you're like,
patterns. You might repeat those same patterns in a relationship where they're not really
no,
opposite in that.
absolutely,
Do you know what I mean?
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But when you lose that person, you now have to lose all those patterns. And
Mm.
so ultimately, what we're showing is that if we can understand Markov blankets, or, like, the boundaries that surround a system, and
Mm.
that define the active and sensory state of the system, let's be a little loose for
Mm.
social system, but ultimately, um, And then you understand that they can be hierarchical. So you have lower level nodes and then higher level nodes. And you and I in a relationship, we now have this higher level nodes. The pain of the loss of a relationship is a tiny little death. Like
Mm,
we
mm.
you don't know what it feels like to die, but if
It
you
still
have
hurts, man. It still hurts
this,
years later.
it's
I've had a few
probably
myself.
something like that.
It
It
still
is
hurts.
the
I still
solution.
relive it now. It's like, ooh, still there, man.
Exactly.
Mm,
Exactly. And I think we are aware that this is what this dissolution feels like. And
mm,
so, like, obviously you still exist, but that
mm,
thing which you had become sort of grafted to, a part
mm,
literally
mm,
constituted this thing,
mm.
is now gone and hurts.
And
So
you might ask the question. This is sort of venturing into maybe sociology or even sexology now. That is this sort of monogamy set up? Is it a good thing? Because it carries such a weight of risk associated with those little deaths you're talking about. You think of all the heartache that's out there at the moment because of this system that we've got, and then that raises questions about the emergence of marriage as some kind of solution to sexual democratization and things like that. And so, any thoughts on that? That's quite an interesting area, isn't it?
I really do have
Should
some
should
thoughts.
we marry, or is this monogamy? Is it crazy? Is it just too hurtful? It's like having a pet dog or something. It's like it's going to die at some point. I don't know. I don't know. Thought.
I mean, I definitely have some thoughts. My first thought is polyamory doesn't mean you won't have heartbreak.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Anybody
yeah,
who's been polyamorous knows that it's just monogamy times five.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it still hurts, right?
So
You'll still have
celibacy is the only answer. Celibacy is clearly the only answer.
I think it's more so I have some critiques of monogamy as it is formulated now, and I also understand some of its benefits. Like
Mm,
things didn't evolve just because they had some purpose, or at least they had some advantages that
mm,
allowed them to be maintained somehow at the forefront of our societal structures. Now, sometimes they maintain structures which are like patriarchy and capitalism. And so, in that sense, I do see their benefit for that, but I'm also critical of them because of that. But
mm,
there is something to be said for stability. So I'm going to link it to active inference. So in one of our papers, we talk about resilience and we say, well, what constitutes resilience? Resilience is sort of threefold. You have inertia. So, like, think of a cup, for example. A cup has a lot of inertia. It doesn't change when I tap it. It doesn't really react to physical trauma unless it's a really, really big error. But then it can't build itself back. So
mm,
inertia has benefits, but it also has drawbacks. It makes things relatively brittle to a degree of error. Then you have
mm,
elasticity. Okay, well, elasticity is I'm a little bit gummy, right? I can move, I can, shift, but I'll come back to where I was, which means the same error
mm,
is probably going to make me shift again. And ultimately, one day, because of entropy, I'm probably going to snap.
mm,
It may not happen right away, but it'll happen. And now the last piece is okay, well, then plasticity. I move and I bend and I come back, but I've learned on the way. So the same error won't catch me the same way. And so I'll last even longer. I'm still gonna die because again, entropy and like there's only so much energy, but
mm,
it'll take much, much, much longer. So
mm,
why does this relate? Well,
mm,
in systems, what you want to have is a degree of degeneracy. You want to have systems that have similar functions, right?
mm,
Because then if one dies, there's still one left. So you want to have a degree of stability that keeps
mm,
you sort of the same identity, right? You're still this thing that still exists. You're not dissolving.
mm,
But at the same time, you're not just staying as you are. You can have these pieces that now, because there's redundancy, this hand, while it's typing something, this one can grab a cup and drink. I have
mm,
the ability to now extend and potentially accrue some error I wouldn't have been able to do if I was just doing the same thing with both. And so, what
mm,
you want to have is a form of like, there's two things, right? You want to have this core, this sort of stable core that
mm,
you know for a fact is protected because it can keep doing what it needs to do, but it'll also feed these external parts that are more
mm,
connected to reality in the external world and are able to accrue error and learn and grow and do new
mm.
things. And
Yeah.
so, what this gives you is like a system will sort of extend into these. Um, specialized forms. So my whole body is not a sphere. It's I've got hands and feet and organs. The organs themselves have a degree of coherence to themselves, right?
Mm,
But they do specialize to do something. And so I think most systems sort of need that. You need a core, and then you need an exploratory externalism. So how does that
mm,
relate to monogamy and, let's say, polyamory or other forms of openness? Um,
mm,
Monogamy has the benefit that you know you will have a stable core. Now, it doesn't always work because humans are difficult, because we've pushed ideals about what it even means to have a core,
mm,
because we've made society into a hellscape that forces people to be so alienated from themselves that there's barely any self to give to each other, right? Like, you make children and then you never see them. You get
mm,
married, but you
mm,
spend an hour or two of privileged time together. You
mm,
lose yourself and not even having any part of yourself that has likes or hobbies that you can then bring back and share with your partner. So
mm,
monogamy is difficult because of these expectations that forever, forever in my life,
mm,
I will love you exactly the same way as when we first met, which is chemically impossible except for like two or three unicorn individuals and prairie voles. And so like these expectations make monogamy very difficult. Not impossible,
mm,
but difficult. So if we were to shift our expectations about monogamy such that monogamy is about it's a partnership. That's what it is. It doesn't have to do anything with sex. It has nothing to do with love. It can, and maybe you will love each other, and maybe your love will
mm,
transform into something tender and
mm,
companionship, but ultimately it's about building something solid. I think it would have strong legs. Now,
mm,
polyamory, similarly, you will have to deal with the same things. You will need at some point some
mm,
kind of stability. So some people choose to have, solo poly. So their stability comes from themselves and themselves alone, and everybody else around are like little comets that pass in their life, but they are not the source of their stability. And other people
mm,
choose some forms of a continuum over that where they have like a committed partner and then people around, or
mm,
like a polycule, which is somewhat committed. And I feel like marriage doesn't have to be incompatible with that, like this sort of proto-monogamous notion of marriage. I think we just have to understand that maybe there's someone for you out there that can be your partner for life, but it doesn't have to be the person you have sex with all
mm,
the time. It doesn't have
mm,
to be the only person you're in love with. And it certainly doesn't have to be someone you betray if ever you are to feel those things. You just have to remind each other that what you have for each other is privileged in some way
mm,
because it won't break. So
mm.
that's my perspective on
So
the
no,
whole
that's
model.
really. I think there's tons there. So in some sense, you're suggesting that actually it's healthy to have a kind of varied landscape, right? So I think we touched on something like that. So that's one thing about it. But um, to think that a particular model is going to be a successful model, though, and to sort of see any alternatives as kind of threatening to that. I mean I mean that's the reality of where we really are, isn't it? It's kind of, we still say, I mean, when I grew up with my Catholic grandparents, right? And they had separate bedrooms from the age of 40 onwards, right? And I used to puzzle over that and think, I couldn't live like that, right? And
Really? I think you should.
yeah.
Separate bedrooms are no, no, no.
Well,
I
I agree with I agree with the man cave thing. I think man caves are quite important.
Have you, maybe, okay, I love sleeping alone, whether I'm in a couple or alone.
Right,
My,
right.
my bed, you are welcome in it
Yeah.
sometimes.
I like to have that option. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yeah, yeah. To have
No,
the
but
option.
also
I've
I
got
think you need to, I mean, oftentimes, and this is where I'm back to, there have been patterns in monogamy that are a bit toxic. This notion that, for example, if you have a privileged self, you're somehow betraying the other. That's a
mm,
very toxic belief that monogamous, let's say, Hollywood sphere has put in our heads. Not just Hollywood sphere, but like all Judeo-Christianity. But like
mm,
ultimately, you know, if you have your own self where sometimes you welcome the other purely and with no judgment, but then you return to yourself without feeling like the other is somehow a threat to that, I think a lot of marriages
mm,
would be much healthier.
absolutely right. A minute ago, you used the word hellscape to describe the situation we've got ourselves into sociologically, right? And that just kind of resonates a little bit because, sometimes I just kind of look out at stuff. I mean, even before the Europe, Ukraine war and stuff like that, it's disheartening, isn't it, to see
Mm.
what we've got ourselves into. But I was thinking about, child rearing and things like that. And you mentioned earlier that children, we just give them to the schools. So, and in
Yeah.
many cases, my ex-wife is currently teaching kids who are sort of 7 or 8 years of age, and some of them are so horribly neglected at home. They're not properly looked after. They smell bad, and they're not washed. And there's
Wow.
one girl that gives her a big hug every morning. She won't let go of her and stuff like that. And I think,
Wow.
and I'm a bit of a kind of archaic revivalist, right? So I kind of look back to earlier times, and Terence McKenna used to talk about stuff like this with the sort of nomadic tribes, so that the parental lineage wouldn't be so clear, right?
Mm-mm-mm.
For various reasons, right? And but there was something sort of healthy sounding about that, where the sort of clan would raise the children so the young people wouldn't be
Yeah.
burdened with child rearing responsibilities and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, but actually, we've got ourselves, it's almost like there's some continuity there, because that's what we do now anyway. The state raises our children in schools, and especially some of these kids that don't get much love at home. I mean, they wouldn't be raised anywhere else. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
any thoughts on that? I mean, we're kind of venturing into sort of some strange territory here, but
No, no, I mean, I've thought about these questions a lot, and it does touch on like what constitutes a superstructure and what is the purpose of
mm,
superstructure relative to power and how culture is passed along. And I don't disagree with you. I think we have externalized a lot of the social processes that used to be much more localized. So, for example, police, the army, the schooling, general education institutions, these are all processes that we've sort of decided. Let's pool everything into a centralized node to cover more people
mm,
somehow, either more efficiently or more systematically. And that has some benefits, right? Like
mm,
the printing press had some benefits because now everyone could access, well, at least the Bible, and then
mm,
everyone had a relationship to God. It didn't have to go through one person whose interpretation may or may not be super harmful, and therefore you kill all women in your village because they're all witches, right? Like there was a benefit to some of these things.
mm,
But I mean, I agree with you that we have alienated certain things by taking this global approach. For example, you touched on the clan and the role of older adults in
mm,
child rearing. And I mean, this has a sort of natural logic to it, right? Like,
mm,
if you are no longer physically strong enough to be, gallivanting and hunting and whatever, maybe
mm.
you are still strong enough to deal with the child, right? Like maybe
Exactly,
you're
yeah.
still like go whoop whoop whoop, not in the
Mm,
river. Like there's things like that, but also because you can't be running around all the time, you have
mm,
time to talk. You have time
mm,
to share what you have learned. You have time to talk about the norms and the stories and pass along knowledge. That's all you
mm,
have to do, basically. And so
mm.
there was this sort of beautiful naturalness to the ways that our ages sort of
Yeah,
lined
yeah.
up towards social processes. And now
Mm,
we have definitely lost that. We've
mm,
told, well, education is more complex than just grandma telling you stories, so we'll make teachers do it. And to some extent, that's very true. But we've also completely let go of our elders. They're,
mm.
they're I mean, they're just dying in
Yeah.
homes. Yeah,
They see themselves, that they
understandably.
see that they've been trained to see themselves as burdens as
Oh,
well.
absolutely. And it's
It's
silly because
tragic.
like there are a lot of experiments that put children in older people's homes, if only
Mm,
like as a sort of
yeah. And
uh
animals as well. They use animals as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it improves the lives of the elders. It makes them more
Mm,
stimulated. It makes their cognitive functions last longer. It makes the children happy because they're
mm,
taken care of, they're loved. They get attention much more
mm.
personalized than one poor person taking care of 20 children at once. It does
Yeah.
have a social purpose that we have forgotten. So this links to do you know anything about bonobos?
No. Oh, bonobo monkeys.
Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. They're quite active, aren't they?
They're
Yeah.
fascinating because they have this allo mothering. And
Right.
so that's it's a simple concept. The mothers take care of all children, and so they have the ability to also rest and just and pool the resources such that the
Mm.
children are optimally
So
taken care
all
of.
mothers take care. So all the mothers take
That's
care
right.
of all the children
That's right,
collectively, right?
exactly.
So
So they still know who
yeah.
their children are. They just take
Mm,
care of all of them. And it
mm,
is an optimal system. And so what you find is that in order to maintain this allo mothering, they have to, one, regulate systems of competition. So they tend to push away males who are too violent. but they also foster intimate relationships among the females because that allows them to be closer and more willing to take care of each other's children. And
Yeah.
so, what's our problem right now? One of the core problems of our society, if you had to boil it down to one thing, is hyper individualism. Like,
Mm.
yes, we're hyper connected, but not in a meaningful way. Most people feel very isolated, and they also think in an isolated way. They do not consider how their political thoughts, their praxis might affect other
Mm.
people who they barely even see as human anymore.
Mm.
Um, so they're certainly not going to try and taking care of their children. In the US right now, some people criticize the fact of giving lunches to children. They took that down. There were programs, just make sure, not a lot, right? Just make sure kids at school would get a lunch if they didn't have one. And they knocked that down. Like
That's crazy.
that's it's
I mean,
it's borderline evil, but it's not
yeah.
even they don't mean to be evil. They're just not thinking about other people. So
Mm.
I think this sort of return to social cohesion through, just kindness and
Mm.
love and affection to each other might actually solve quite a bit of
Mm.
problems.
But you mentioned earlier that some of these kind of sort of philosophical insights, or maybe insights about active inference and so on, they could be really helpful to foster sort of social change and so on. But how do we get people from this kind of naive realism perspective, where they literally just think they're staring out of a glass plate window into a world that's there, whether they're there or not, and all this kind of stuff? How do we get people from that, which seems to be the prevailing, sort of normative view, perhaps, to where we think we need them to get to? I mean, that's where sort of that's one of the things I want to try and do, is kind of make some of these things accessible, to ordinary folk, if you like, right? Dare I say it? Is that worth doing, do you think? I mean,
I think so. I mean, again, this is the work that I keep bringing it back, but like
mm,
Adam Safron is trying to do, Adam
mm.
Goldstein as well.
I've got to read that. I
Um,
basically have to read that, don't
no,
I?
no, I know, but like this is
So-
the work they're doing. They're trying to basically justify to a field that has been mostly dominated by that kind of philosophy,
mm,
that the kind of philosophy, the kind of science they're doing points in a different direction than they think. We
mm,
should not be um, reactionary. We should not be um, structuring at the level that we uh, pull away from each other. In fact, the core of what we seem to be finding is that it really only is one field. And in the valence on that field is a question of perspective. And so if you understand that perspective and valence are linked, then perhaps what we need to create is a system where things are happy where they are, potentially, with enough information exchange such as to stay connected, but not too much information exchange as to be constantly sources of friction. I think that's the core of what they're trying to get to, and ultimately that solving suffering for everyone comes through looking inwards and realizing inwards and outwards are not as dualistic as we'd like to think. So a lot of people need to start doing a lot of self-reflection, which I think is a skill that Gen Z um, has sort of gotten embedded for free. Lucky little, like they they were steeped in therapy, whereas like boomers and millennials, like millennials had to like unpack this trauma and it was hard. Boomers just kind of push it away,
yeah.
but like Gen Z got it for free.
Mm. I mean,
So
I'm Gen X. I mean, we weren't allowed to cry or anything. Boys just
exactly,
I got beaten up.
exactly.
I wanted to go and do dance and drama at school, but I got, you get picked on. So it's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't
No,
want the trouble.
precisely. But we've sort of,
So
there's this sort of line of like Gen Z seems to have this ability to
mm.
look inwards and like we make
Yeah, they've
fun
got a
of
good grip. They actually have a good approach to their internal world. Whereas,
exactly
half
and
the
the
half the people my age
self-control
are still in deny. Deny they even have one.
and boundaries. They have healthy boundaries because as soon as you have a good sense of self, you have a good sense of boundaries, and suddenly you're
Mm.
not afraid of letting other people in. So
Mm,
I think we're aiming in the right direction.
yeah.
Inshallah, if Gen Z keeps going in that direction, we may be headed in the
Mm.
right place. So I'm somewhat hopeful, you know.
So you're an optimist then? You think we're going in the right direction? We will win this. You know, who was it who said history is a race between education and disaster? You know, do you think education will win?
I think there is a pendulum swing ongoing,
Mm,
and I think we're going to have to ride that wave, and nothing is ever certain. Things can always
mm,
devolve and feedback loop into negative feedback loop and dissolution, right? Like that's always
mm,
possible. But if we pass this pendulum swing, we will swing in the other direction and potentially further, and we may
mm,
come to an age, however finite, of wonder and beauty and unity. So let's hope we write it out.
mm. Do you think things like the internet, is that a deliberate act by nature to sort of connect us, to enable these kind of complex exchanges of information and so on? And is it like an emergent phenomena that we couldn't have stopped if we tried?
I mean, I like that question for multiple reasons, and I think because it happened, ultimately it was unstoppable. Yeah, otherwise
Mm.
it wouldn't have happened. But
True
I
that.
also like it because I don't think that humans are not part of nature. I think that that distinction
Mm,
is a very silly one, like the distinction between, natural and artificial,
mm,
which is also why, to me, artificial intelligence is a weird term because
it is, isn't it? Yeah.
you're just creating a form of child, really. You're just putting out a possible consciousness into the world that just happens to have a different body than yours, or at least be constituted of different kinds of things. So, uh, yeah, yeah.
Mm. And I suppose I wanted to talk about so that one of the terms that came up in some of your interviews I've seen online was agentic realism, and I think that's probably one of the coolest sort of pairs of words I've ever. So what does that mean? What is agentic realism? I think you can it sort of contains the answer in itself in a way, but what's your view on this?
Well, it relates to neo-materialism as developed by Karen Barrett. Basically, she talks about it in her book Meeting the Universe Halfway.
Right.
So basically, she integrates quantum physics, feminist theory, and she just says that uh, reality, knowledge, and agency is a blurry term always, but they emerge through the dynamic interactions of entities rather than as static, predefined entities. So um,
Right.
that's what agentic realism is. And so it puts at the center the role of agency, will, and back to consciousness. So there's a very
Mm.
strong there.
And again, so this notion of the creation of sort of
Yeah,
reality, if you like, through
yeah,
this interaction,
precisely.
that
She
kind of
she talks.
reminds me a little bit of Whitehead. The idea of these. Have you come across A.M. Whitehead at all?
I
Um,
It's
you know,
somehow vaguely familiar.
process philosopher.
Do you want to say
Talks
more?
about he talks about these occasions of experience, which again, it just feels like there's a dotted line between that and some of the things that you're talking about. This sense of co-creation and so on. But just
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
mm,
Interaction. Yeah, yeah, precisely. I'd have to
mm,
look more. I feel like someone mentioned this and told me to read it, and I never did.
mm.
So now I have no excuse anymore.
It's a really hard read. I'll be honest and say I'm struggling. So I've got like three of his books and I keep trying each one of them and I'm sort of, yeah, it's hard going, but there's something in there, I think. Um, Also, epistemic communities came up. Could you flesh out that concept for us a little bit? And what all that's about and how it fits with all this other stuff.
Yes, I mean it touches back on this notion of shared consciousness, where if we understand consciousness as a way to again carve reality at its joints, what you have is a way to map certain sensory input and certain breakdowns of sensory inputs into concepts ultimately, and into causes and relationships, etc.
Mm,
And so you and I probably share a lot of these. but not everything.
Mm,
So you and I exist on a distribution of an epistemic community. Now, there's some people in the world that think very, very differently from me, and they're probably not at all in my epistemic community. So insofar as we could draw a boundary around it.
mm,
And so
mm,
these epistemic communities, they can have some benefits because they allow information sharing, they allow coordination, etc. But they can also have uh, some issues. They can basically um, cause systems to break down and polarize,
mm,
such that eventually we go so far apart that we're no longer able to communicate because we don't even
mm,
map the same sensory input to the same concepts. We are
mm,
literally not talking about the same things when we talk. So
mm,
there's a communication breakdown here that has obviously impacts in terms of praxis and ethics, etc., that
mm,
mean that if I can't exchange with you anything or agree on what the definition of good is, then we can't move forward. And we're
mm,
going to stay in our bubbles, and ultimately, we're going to break this organism that is able to accrue information and accrue error such that
mm,
you integrate it and learn. You make these communities self-reinforcing because they're no longer exposed to external
mm,
feedback and
mm.
they become vulnerable to error.
Mm. And that's one of the most sort of tragic things about humanity, in a sense, isn't it? That truly, there's probably just one or two pages about us in the animal encyclopedia, really, in terms of habits and predispositions and so on. But all the shit that we get into is just kind of imagined stuff, isn't it? Like wars and political disagreements. These are literally just imagined worlds. I mean, people talk about the kind of maybe anxieties about getting into virtual realities and stuff. I say we're kind of already in one, right? Yeah, we live in a world. I mean, look here behind me. Every single one of the things in this room is from a mind. So yeah, I mean, how do we unmess ourselves? Because there's a part of me thinking that you need these epistemic communities to form, enough of a concrete social setting in the first place to even have these conversations, right? So you have to have that, but then you get sort of dogmatism and polarization, so on and so
Yeah.
forth. But again, I bring the internet in. So this is what we were talking about. I was asking the question: is the internet some kind of
Right?
is it some sort of teleal? Is it there to help resolve this problem? Because then you got to a point where every node in the network has access to every other node. Technically, I know you then still form these online epistemic communities within that technology, but at least it gives us a chance now. At least there's a chance of me understanding what it's like to be a Japanese farmer, right, or a Chinese kite maker or something. That's out there now. It's a possibility
Yeah,
for me.
yeah, yeah.
Any
So,
thoughts?
yeah, absolutely. So with David Hyland, who is a brilliant young researcher, you should Google his work. He's
Hmm.
very promising from Oxford. And we're working on a concept, or at least on a way to measure the cost of changing your mind.
Right.
And based on that, what constitutes the optimal path towards a point in belief space, right? Um, and so if you take that into consideration, plus you understand power dynamics that are basically the entailment of shifting attentional fields, right? And so I not only am shifting your attentional fields, but I'm doing so such that you will follow a path that leads you to where I want you to eventually end up.
Hmm.
We can potentially um, deprogram certain isolated bubbles of thought and come back to these enmeshing pools of connectivity. Now,
Hmm.
Karl has the thought that you don't want everything talking to everything all the time. In fact, that's a problem because you need some specialization to be able to do what it needs to do. So its attention can't be constantly taken. But you
Mm.
also need the ability to have these differences of perspective to some extent, because if you don't have them, then who's exploring? You need the ability for some people to break away from where we currently are even
Mm.
if they're misguided. You need the ability for some degree of exploration. Now,
Mm.
ideally, you wouldn't re-explore the same things over and over again,
Mm.
but there's a reason we do that, right? There's a reason
Mm,
we sort of lose information, coarse grain some things, build on top of that coarse graining, and then unfortunately, all the information that was lost sort of pulls back down, and you have to go through it again, right?
mm,
That's fine. We're dealing with that. But so I think that's the solution ultimately. It will be work like this, like the one that we're doing with David Hyland. It'll be the ability to understand how do we go from point A to point B in the least amount of friction. And then the second part will be, do we know what constitutes an appropriate point B? And if we believe in something like autopoiesis, maybe we don't need to know what point B is. Maybe all we
mm,
need to know is the correct process to make sure that we are still traveling to some point B in an optimal fashion, such that the system stays to some extent maintained, and
mm.
ultimately they'll self-organize.
That is so mind-bogglingly deep. I think I might be getting a little bit tired. To be honest, I think I might be tiring a little bit. It's past midnight here, but
Oh
there
my
was some,
God.
there was something that came up as well. You were having a chat with a lady called Andrea Hiot, I think,
Yeah,
and you were
yeah.
talking about a map is its own territory. Now that's, the sort of classic statement of the map isn't the territory, and we shouldn't invest too much optimism in physics models to tell us what's out there and so on, as it questions in the foundations of physics and so on. So I didn't quite get to grips with what was being said there. Would you mind unpacking that a little bit for us? So what do you
Yeah, I
mean by a
mean,
map is also its territory? I mean, do you still agree with that? I mean,
yeah, of course, but I mean, ultimately, it comes back to what I just said. There is a degree to which measurement entails a coarse graining. And if everything measures everything else, such that you always have these hierarchical systems that do a degree of measurement, and by becoming a new scale, a new entity, they lose information, they become a map of an
mm,
underlying territory to some extent.
mm,
So that's why every map is its own form of territory. It's its own form of coarse graining reality, such that
mm,
it aims towards a teleology to some extent that is related to ultimately the phenotype that created the map to begin with. So
mm,
I think that's what the statement, it's a very what would you call it, pithy statement to just mean that.
mm. So what do you think's really going on then? I mean, what is the world?
Oh my God! What is the world?
Yeah, what is it in 5 minutes?
My view on it, which is probably not accurate, and I trust people more like, again, Dalton, Jacques Tavadivel, or even Karl, but I like to think of it as fields that create waves that have an information geometry, and that information geometry interacts with each other. And ultimately, because those patterns build on each other, but also constrain each other, you have these sort of solidified patterns that constitute statistical, regularities. And these
Hmm.
statistical regularities become what we understand as material reality. So
Mm.
that's my understanding of it.
What, what,
But yeah,
what
go
is
for it.
death? What would you say about death within that sort of framework?
So that's a funny question because I I used to have this argument with someone, and he used to tell me ghosts don't exist. And anytime there was a mention of ghosts, he was like, ghosts don't exist. And that was kind of a joke. And at some point, I'm a bit obnoxious, so I was like, define ghost. And so and I feel like I can justify a form of concept, let's say metaphor of a ghost, because I'm saying metaphor not because I don't think they exist, but because I think I'm stretching the definition of what people colloquially understand,
Mm.
but it does map to what they understand. So
Mm. Yeah,
to
yeah.
me, a ghost is the echo of a wave. I'm being very very
Hmm.
broad with the term wave,
Yeah.
but let's assume that you because of what you are, because of your manifold, and because of your effect on the world, you are a wave. Now, the degree to which your wave is identifiable in the world is the degree to which you will affect the world and be remembered. And so to
Mm,
me, Jesus is a very, very powerful ghost.
mm,
He, whether he
yeah.
exists or not, or has existed, this identifiable wave to this
Mm,
day still affects us. And so
mm,
maybe you will affect the world in such a way that, in 50 years, people will still be watching your videos. And so your effect on the world is continued. Maybe my wave will be, I die tomorrow and nobody remembers. So, but
mm,
it's not that I didn't affect the world, is that I'm no longer identifiable as the sort of causal source of some changes. I did cause them. I did cause
mm,
changes in the world, but
mm,
nobody can pinpoint this as me. So to me, a
mm,
ghost is just that, is a sort of echo of an identifiable source that still somehow resonates in the world. And so we, colloquially or in horror movies, we like to think of a things still move. But if I'm stretching this a little bit, like
mm,
people who go to the graveyards, they are being moved by someone who no longer technically exists as a consciousness or as a
mm,
person, because consciousness in this case is a bit blurry. Like if I continue reading this book by this person who wrote it ages and ages ago, they're still affecting me. Their
mm,
mind, the product of their consciousness, which now is able to resonate through me, still exists. So to me, death, and this is why I was talking about
mm,
ghosts, um, it constitutes perhaps the dissipation of the center of the causal point. Remember we talked about this sort of subjective origin point
mm,
that condenses negentropy in an area that is identifiable as causal. But
mm,
that doesn't mean that you'll stop being somewhat causal in the world. It's just that
mm,
your entity is no longer easily identifiable in one point in the world, and eventually it'll dissolve completely, right?
mm.
So that's, yeah,
I suppose you could still be seen as having caused all of those future impressions and memories and so on as well, because they were your acts in the first place that led to those impressions. And in that sense, we're kind of all immortal, really, aren't we? In that sense, because of course the you that we're dealing with in the first place, we're not so clear on what is human identity. I mean, again, sort of common sense view is that there's this stick of rock that says Matt all the way through my life, and it's that that's experiencing all of these different things, whereas I now don't think that. And I mean, for a while that was quite destabilizing as well. The thought that this kind of naive sense of continuing identity probably just isn't there. Just to Levin's point that actually already I'm not a single thing anyway. I'm a collective. This is kind of like
exactly.
this is the sort of God voice of this collective, right?
Yes, the Theseus ship
And so
ultimately. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. But I mean, you're right. I think this is part of what's keeping us from true transhumanism ultimately, because I feel like part of our problem with, let's say, extending ourselves outside this fleshy body, is the fear that there's a discontinuity in our identity. And
mm,
that's
mm,
very real, right?
mm,
And I think that's an illusion.
yeah.
Ultimately, if we understand
Yeah, I mean,
how
you could slowly replace every single part of my body, and then eventually get to my brain once we got the tech to do that. And at what point do I cease to be? It's
exactly.
just the ship of what is it?
Theseus, yeah, yeah.
That's right. You replace every plank, and it's still so. That's fascinating. Yeah. Sorry, did you have any more to say on that?
No, I mean, I think one day we will solve this problem, and that's
Mm,
the day where we have to decide whether we want to clone ourselves or whether we
oh
want
yeah.
to become androids or
Mm,
whether we want to um, uh, augment ourselves. But until we've done that, this sense of boundary and identity relative to our boundary, that's adaptive. We need that because that forces us to try to protect the boundary. So we'll have to undo that very carefully if we wish to do so.
Mm. So, I mean, could you envisage us becoming? Have you ever seen the Borg on Star Trek? You know, it's kind
Yeah.
of like, have you seen Star Trek?
Yeah, but I mean the concept of the Borg is pretty prevalent in a lot of other tropes, right? This idea of hive mind that thinks the same.
Mm.
Recently in Arcane, the same concept was leveraged, and
What the Netflix series Arcane?
yeah.
That was that was so cool. It's just like,
It
I mean,
was,
the
huh?
graphic, the whole. I was just absolutely blown apart for every
Yeah.
second. I mean, I'm going to watch it again. That was unreal.
Did you watch season two?
Yeah. It was
So
just.
spoilers.
Mm.
Whoever is watching this video, spoilers. In season two at the end, Victor, I mean, he goes through a whole arc where he tries to solve humanity's core problems. And he goes, well, humanity's existence core problems, and he goes through
Mm.
phases. First, he tries to improve materiality, by giving them a new technology. That doesn't
Mm.
work. Then
Mm.
he tries to improve their social reality by basically giving a new socioeconomic structure to disempowered entities at
Mm.
the condition of accepting to coordinate together, but that's still um, liable to fail because of external pressures who may
Mm.
want what they have, so that fails. So then he comes to the conclusion, okay, well then I have to go to the core of the problem. I have to get rid of all friction. And the only way to get rid of all friction is to get rid of all alternative models.
Mm.
And the conclusion of the show, which to me was very disappointing, was that one, that leads to death. And we could argue as to whether difference is the only source of life. And I mean, there's an
Mm.
argument to be made for that, but ultimately, I think that was kind of glossed over and sort of caricatured.
Mm.
And the second point is that because this perspective is enforced, it is wrong. And I'm like, "Mm, that doesn't freedom is not an absolute. There is no such thing as absolute freedom. If you were
Mm.
absolutely free, then you would be fully entropic and there would be no you.
Mm.
You'd be equally probable in every possible sense. You would literally dissolve. So everything about reality is a question of constraint. Now, it's a
Mm.
degree of constraint relative to some objectives that you think are related to your optimal states, which themselves are constraining. So I contest this notion that because it's enforced, it's wrong. Because
Mm.
sometimes you have to do things for people who do not understand that it's good for them, like children,
Mm.
for example. Children do not know that eating vegetables is good for them, and if you let
Mm.
them, they would only eat, sausage and
Mm.
sweets. And
Yeah.
God bless them, right? I also would eat only
Yeah.
sausage and sweets if I could, but there is such a thing as the vegetables and you have to eat them. It's good for
Mm.
you. And so sometimes you
Boundaries are
agree.
healthy, absolutely. They need to know that they will die if they run off a cliff and things like this. You've got to intervene. There has to be,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Precisely. And so what this speaks to is not that some people are children and some people are not. It speaks to
Mm.
everyone, because of the nature of perspective, has a limited view of reality. And because
Mm.
you have a limited view of reality, there are things which you will not be as qualified to speak to than other people. And that may be
Mm.
true for everyone. There are things that someone who lives really, really far away, who hasn't studied what I have studied, will teach me because I have no idea what their reality is like or what it is that
Mm.
they've studied, etc. So when we think like this, we understand that if there was some decisions I could offload to some things who knows more about this area of reality than I do,
Mm.
perhaps I should. Perhaps I
Mm.
should listen to this thing because I will
Yeah.
never see the full picture the way that they would relative to that perspective.
This reminds me of the whole sort of guild system. So sort of respecting expertise in particular fields rather than respecting political power. Do you see what I mean? And
Mm-mm-mm.
so, it's sort of the medieval towns, actually, sort of the guilds would have, even the peasants would have a guild, right?
Yeah.
And so even they would have a place at the table in terms of local decision making and so on and so forth. But that's quite interesting. Yeah. Where do we get to? Again, I think I'm getting a bit tired here.
You are, yeah, it is very late. You know, we can stop, right? It is 7:30, so we've done an hour and a half. It's completely right if you want to
It's
stop.
been really cool. It's been a really, really fun conversation. I feel we've covered loads of stuff that I need to go away and think about as well. There's some really, really deep things here that I don't quite get, I'll be honest. But thanks so much for spending the time to
Well,
talk
I'm,
to
I'm
us.
glad you enjoyed it. And if there's some pieces of this that kind of sound like they don't make sense when you are feeling a little bit more awake and you're like, no, that made no sense, do cut it out. It's okay. It's all right if
Yeah,
I don't
sure.
make sense. Uh,
But no, it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and thanks, real privilege. Thanks for making the time and so on. And hopefully we can talk again at some point in the future.
absolutely, I'd love that.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.